When you read the Apostle Paul's letter to the Colossians, you might run into a passage that makes you a little uncomfortable. It almost sounds like he's defending slavery. In Colossians 3:22-23, he writes, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters." So, what's the deal? Was Paul really okay with the Roman system of slavery? The answer isn't a simple yes or no. There's a lot going on beneath the surface of these words. I want to look at what Paul was saying from two angles, the big picture view and the personal, close-up view. By understanding what he was really getting at, I think we can discover how we're supposed to deal with the massive injustices in our own world today.
The big picture, the systemic evil of Roman slavery.
First, we have to understand that slavery in Paul's time wasn't anything like a bad job with a tough boss. It was a brutal system that treated human beings like tools or livestock. The entire Roman economy would have collapsed without slave labor. Slaves worked the farms, the mines, and the homes. This wasn't just a few bad people doing bad things. It was a structural evil that the whole society depended on. The law defined a slave not as a person, but as property. A master could kill his slave and face no consequences. Everyone just accepted this inhumane system as normal. So for a couple of slaves or a small community to start a protest was basically suicide. A full-blown rebellion like the one Spartacus led was brutally crushed. Direct opposition was a dead end.
The close-up view, how people coped.
So, how did people react inside this oppressive system? If you were a slave, you had to accept that you were trapped in a world of evil and figure out how to survive. The most common way to do that was what Paul called eye service. Let's be real. It's just a fancy term for laziness, for doing the bare minimum. I've seen this firsthand since moving to the United States. I've had to deal with government offices where the pace of work is so slow it's almost unbelievable. I was in an emergency room once where a young man was bleeding and groaning from a car accident. Instead of helping him, they just sat him in a chair and made him wait for hours while the nurses laughed and joked around. Maybe that was just a one-off, but it was hard for me to wrap my head around. Even when we hired contractors to do some work on our church, they promised it would be done in a month, but 2 months later they were nowhere near finished. Some days they'd show up and pretend to work for a few hours, and other days they just wouldn't come at all. Sure, you can say there are big structural problems in America that caused this, but the same was true in Rome. When you're stuck in a broken system, the easiest attitude to adopt is laziness and eye service. The Roman response to this, of course, was just more suspicion, more whippings, and more cruelty.
Paul's strategy, a quiet revolution to shake the system.
The kind of slavery Paul was dealing with was a massive evil that lasted right up until Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and even that didn't end it overnight. Paul saw the whole picture. He saw the giant evil system, and he saw the suffering of the people trapped inside it. He knew a political protest wouldn't work, so instead, he offered a solution that was slower but far more radical. He went after the smallest unit in the system, the relationship between one person and another. Here's a modern paraphrase of what Paul was saying to the slaves in Colossians 3. Don't let this broken system crush your spirit. Don't let it steal your integrity. The one you're really working for isn't your Roman master, it's the Lord in heaven. If you slack off and do the bare minimum, you're giving up your own God-given dignity. He was giving them back their sense of purpose and worth. He was reminding them that no matter what the world said, they had to hold on to their own humanity. Then in the very next chapter, Paul turns to Christian masters. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. This was revolutionary. He was telling them that their power wasn't absolute. He was demanding that they treat their property as an equal human being before God. Paul knew he couldn't tear down the institution of slavery overnight. Instead, he worked to change the hearts of the people within it. He was laying a spiritual and moral foundation that in the long run would make the whole evil structure crumble.
How the early church lived it out.
The first Christians didn't just turn these teachings into doctrines, they lived them out in ways that shocked their neighbors. First, they created a community at the dinner table that shattered social classes. In Rome, who you ate with was a big deal. It showed your status. But at the Christian agape feasts and communion services, those rules went out the window. Masters and slaves, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile all sat and ate the same meal together. This was a radical act. It was also one of the main reasons they were persecuted. Second, we have the story of Onesimus and Philemon. This is a real-life example of how this teaching changed everything. Onesimus was a runaway slave. Legally, his master, Philemon, could have had him executed as a warning to others. But Paul sends Onesimus back with a letter asking Philemon to welcome him no longer as a slave, but as a dear brother. He was telling them to replace a relationship of ownership with one of love. Inside the church, God's rules were taking over. Third, they tore down the walls of ownership. The book of Acts says that no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. This wasn't about abolishing private property, it was a whole new attitude. It meant that what was mine was available for the good of the community. Taking care of widows, orphans, and the poor became a central part of church life. In a dog-eat-dog world, this was a sign that a new kind of family, God's family, had arrived.
So what went wrong?
If the early church had built on these beautiful traditions, slavery might have been abolished centuries earlier. Why didn't that happen? First, they compromised with the system. After Emperor Constantine made Christianity legal, people flooded into the churches. But many weren't coming because they believed in Jesus. They were coming for social status and to get ahead. They brought the world's values, its hierarchies and power games, with them. The church had a choice: stay a small, committed community or become a massive, popular institution. Then, as now, they chose the masses. Second, they got into bed with power. As the church partnered with the state, it stopped criticizing the system and started justifying it. Pastors who wanted to be politically powerful came on the scene and created theologies that defended slavery or blessed wars. It's not so different from what we see today with pastors who cozy up to political power. Third, they lost the purity of the gospel. Being a Christian is supposed to be about a commitment to Jesus, even if it costs you. But it slowly became a way to get blessings and social approval, a kind of prosperity gospel. When the church lost its focus, it missed its chance to abolish the evil of slavery. Instead, it joined hands with power and began a long, slow slide into corruption. The 1,000 years of the medieval church were truly a dark age. It took over a millennium for the church to begin to recover its soul. The abolition of slavery, thanks to people like William Wilberforce, was fundamentally a recovery of that original gospel spirit. It wasn't until the 1800s that Christians began to once again stand against systemic evil as a core part of their faith.
What this means for us, the Christian in today's system.
Our world today is also full of massive structural problems: economic inequality, political division, environmental crises. It's easy to feel powerless and become cynical. It's also easy to just blame individuals and ignore the broken systems. Paul's approach gives us a third way. It's about looking our systemic problems square in the face while at the same time committing to live by the gospel in our day-to-day relationships. It means we don't use a broken system as an excuse to lower our own standards of integrity. Instead, we do our work as for the Lord. It means we don't use our own power to put others down, but we remember that we all answer to a higher authority and we act with humility and justice. In the end, Paul's message is clear. Real change doesn't come from a massive revolution that flips the world upside down overnight. It starts in the small relationships of our lives, with quiet acts of sincere love and faithfulness.
When those small seeds are planted, we will finally get to see God demolish the great walls of our time and change the world. Please consider subscribing and supporting Logos Community in our mission to spread the gospel. Thank you.